Hello and welcome everybody to today's special edition of Mexico News Network's Breaking News. I'm your host, Elliot Bullman. Remember to follow us on all our social networks and to catch us every day by logging onto our website, mexiconewsnetwork.com, for relevant stories and news. Let's start with today's show, focusing on Brexit.
It was not the result I wanted, nor the outcome that I believe is best for the country I love. Let's remember these people have come here and made a wonderful contribution to our country.
In the last few days, all the media, financial experts, politicians, and basically everyone who has heard the word Brexit is asking and trying to understand what this is all about. Well, this is exactly what I'm going to talk to you about today, and how does it affect the UK, Europe, and the rest of the world, including Mexico. The UK held a referendum last week to vote on whether the UK should stay in or leave the European Union. This was not the first such referendum in the UK. In 1975, just 2 years after joining the then EEC, voters went to the polls in a referendum on continued membership. 67% of the electorate voted then to remain in the EEC. As the EEC became the EC and then the EU, it stoked fears about an erosion of British sovereignty. Membership is an issue that has particularly vexed the UK's Conservative Party, with many party members deeply sceptical of the EU's increasing powers. Disagreement and division eventually led to a declaration in September 2013 from British Prime Minister David Cameron, who stated, "We'll give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice." The Prime Minister David Cameron led the campaign to stay in the EU, while former Mayor of London Boris Johnson was the main protagonist in the Leave camp. British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn has been accused by many in his party of showing only lukewarm support for the Remain side, but said a vote to stay in was in the best interests of the UK people. UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage said, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get back the independence and self-government of this nation." And so what happened next? After the stunning exit last Thursday, the UK voted to leave the European Union with 51.9% in favour against 48.1%. All eyes are on what's next. As the saying goes, a week is a long time in politics. The British Prime Minister David Cameron announced his resignation the following morning in the wake of the final result. This is the first time a country has voted to leave the European Union since Greenland in 1982, and experts aren't exactly sure what the outcome of this will be. Any real effect that comes from the Brexit will likely take at least several months to materialise. Politically speaking, the UK government and shadow opposition are in disarray, with several ministers having already resigned following the Brexit, and future leadership will have to deal with healing a society left deeply divided by the bitterness that characterised the UK's Remain Leave campaign. Economically speaking, as the result of the vote became apparent, the British pound fell to levels that haven't been seen since 1985, and overseas equities markets plummeted. The following morning, the FTSE 250 fell by as much as 12.3% before paring losses back to 7.3% by the close. Most notably, Japan's Nikkei 225 fell 5.65%, its worst day in 5 years, as concerns mounted that the Brexit will lead to a new recession in key end markets. But why did all this happen? Well, there are three main reasons why UK citizens voted to leave the EU. Firstly, immigration. The huge influx of people from Europe over the last 10 years has changed the cultural dynamic of the country. This can be viewed as either positive or negative, depending on your perspective. But either way, this did happen, and many people in Great Britain were not happy with this. A lot of people feel that there was a loss of British identity. Politicians ignored this to their peril. The recent Syrian refugee crisis has not helped the situation. Europe's borders are constantly under threat, and the Channel Tunnel is a continued source of attempted illegal immigration. Open borders were an issue for Britain at the outset of the EU experiment, and to a great extent, the worries have proven correct. Secondly, a loss of British identity and independence. Britain had never really identified itself with Europe. It had its own empire, and the growing cultural and institutional impact of Europe did not sit well with the British people. Brussels was increasingly seen as an ivory tower, which was bureaucratic and unaccountable. Britain wants its sovereignty back and to steer its own cultural path. And finally, generational change. Millennials don't feel that they have benefited from the established political setup. The present setup was good for the baby boomer generation. They were able to get good middle-class jobs with good pay and were able to buy a nice house, get a good pension and save money. The new generation can't afford housing. They're moving from gig to gig, and they're the first generation after many years who are not guaranteed to be wealthier than their parents. These younger voters want change and do not share fears of socialism or any memory of a European conflict, which can only be kept together by political and economic union. So after all this, what's next for the UK and its economy? London is likely to lose its revered position as the world's leading financial centre, as the Brexit means losing its privileged access to the EU, the world's largest trading bloc. Major US banks located in Britain have already begun preparing for the possibility that they will no longer be able to provide financial services to EU clients from their current geographic location. Until now, banks around the world have been able to conduct business in the EU by setting up shop in the UK, which has passport privileges to the other 27 member nations. This is one of the primary reasons London has become not only the EU's financial capital, but the world's financial capital as well. Once Article 50 is invoked, it sets a 2-year deadline for trade and immigration negotiations to be struck. Once the 2 years are up, the UK is no longer bound by the European Union treaties. In the coming weeks and months, we can expect the following. A new British Prime Minister. Boris Johnson is the favourite to take over the role. The invoking of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. In a speech after the referendum, Johnson said there was no hurry for the UK to invoke Article 50. There's no need for haste, Johnson said. Further noise also from right-wing EU parties calling for referendums of their own. And what about the global economy? Looking ahead, continued upheaval in the international markets is likely. Some of Britain's major trading partners, such as India and China, are afraid that the split with the EU could lead to regulatory and economic upheaval that could hurt all three economies. And the financial community in the Far East is worried that a drop in the pound could lead to a strengthening of the yen, which would make exports more expensive for buyers. And many companies in the US and China that have previously traded heavily with Britain because of the access that the UK gave them to European channels may now see their profits drastically reduced as a result of this move. And the extended negotiations that will be required in order to facilitate Brexit may lead to a period of further instability in the markets. Now let's talk about how will the Brexit affect Mexico and how is Mexico responding? The immediate reaction to the UK's decision to leave the EU saw a sharp fall in the Mexican peso. The Mexican Treasury Minister and Mexico's central bank have provided reassurances that Mexico has the necessary resources to defend the peso from speculators. Following an analysis of inflation impact, it seems likely that the key interest rate will be adjusted upwards in the near term. Whilst the Treasury Secretary downplayed the impact of the Brexit on Mexico, given the relatively unessential trade flows between the two countries, knowing less than 1% of Mexican exports go to the UK and 2% of the Mexican FDI comes from the UK. It nonetheless seems likely that Mexico will be affected by the secondary effects of Brexit. An uncertain global context can provoke a flight by investors from emerging markets to safe assets, weaker FDI inflows, and most significantly, the Brexit impact on the US, Mexico's key trading partner, is of greater concern. Such negative impacts could mean slower and scarcer inward investment flows, dampening Mexico's already lukewarm economic outlook. What Mexico needs to do now is take advantage of the many international trade agreements it has in place to ensure Mexico's prosperity. The conditions to diversify its trade and address its productivity lag need to be encouraged. Post-Brexit, Mexico needs to redouble its efforts to enhance its competitiveness, build its innovation, and diversify in a meaningful way its trade and integration with the rest of the world. This was all for today. Thank you for staying with us during this special edition focusing on Brexit. I'm your host, Elliot Bullman, and remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. Log on to MexicoNewsNetwork.com for more information on Mexico and the world. Until next time.